So this is our second official podcast for Spiritual Right, and today we're going to talk about basically what we made the last three videos about, which is how do you balance your spiritual life with worldly life? How do you view money from a spiritual perspective? And do you need to live like a monk to be spiritual? And so we're going to kind of go around, I think, first and talk about these three, and after that, have a little bit of a discussion about it all. So yeah, to kind of kick it off. I guess personally, one of the ways that I've found that really helps me balance spiritual life and worldly life is basically trying to do as much as I possibly can. Um, I was a monk for about 15 months, and I spent almost a year at a retreat center before that, and did a bunch of other stuff. And well, I really enjoyed that time and was able to meditate and um, kind of have certain epiphanies and all that. When I came back to the world, I found a lot of it left pretty quickly. Um, as far as just feeling relaxed and comfortable and stress free and all that stuff. So my solution was basically to work as hard as I can to the point where I have basically no choice but to grow spiritually. And it's basically been my strategy kind of ever since disrobing and coming back to the world. That's why I go to school full time. I pick up picked up I started working full time. So I go to school full time, I work full time on an MA to PhD program. I also do this project with the Spiritual Right, as well as dating and all that other good stuff. So family life, you name it. So that's been kind of my solution for balancing them. Really, is basically to make it so I have so much stuff that I have to do and that matters to me, and so much responsibility that I grow. Um, I also do make time for meditating. I really probably meditate about an hour a day, but it ranges on what's going on in my life. So that's kind of my answer to that one. As far as money, um, you know what? Actually, let's go around kind of one, two, three instead of just me talking for all this whole time. Who wants to take up the first one? Go next.
I might as well.
Go for it.
My approach is I just don't differentiate between everyday life and the spiritual life, or what's the thing? Your spiritual life and worldly life.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't think that there's necessarily any differentiation, and I think it could be counterproductive if you compartmentalize your spiritual practice from everything else. You know, it's like everything is a spiritual practice if you just are like completely like you're in the moment and you're doing your best, then it's still a spiritual practice. Like when I was a monk, I didn't really think about, like differentiating everyday life from spiritual practice. It's just everything you do is supposed to be mindful. For example, you're supposed to, like Ram Dass used to say, be here now. And if you're doing that, and even if you're like at work and you're having problems and frustration arises, then you should at least be aware of that. You observe it arising and passing away, and you're still doing spiritual practice. And I have to admit, I was pretty frustrated right before we started doing this, because the tech stuff wasn't working right, the wires and everything. but still, it's like you can be aware of that and observe that, and still you're doing spiritual practice. The everyday person living in the world is following the same spiritual laws as some monk at a monastery or some renunciate out in a forest somewhere. It's all the same Dhamma or Dharma that applies to everyone equally. So I just consider just doing your best. If you love somebody, love them as purely as you can. And if you're working, just work as well as you can, be the best employee or worker that you can. If you're just walking down the street, you're just there in the moment as fully as you can, etc. And it's still spiritual practice. And it's like a higher difficulty setting than being a monk, I suppose, trying to be present and alert and virtuous and everything when you're living in a worldly life. It's much more difficult than if you're just in a cell or in a cave or something. But like I say, it's like the same Dharma applies to everyone. So I don't really think it's necessarily a good idea to compartmentalize and say, now I'm doing spiritual practice, and after an hour then I'll go do worldly stuff, when I mean, you can be doing spiritual practice sitting at McDonald's eating a hamburger or whatever. So I guess I'll just move on. Let the next person talk.
Who's that?
Oh, I will have to go last.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I very much agree with Panyo. My own experiences, I was thinking about this the other day. I was talking to someone about, what is meditation? What is the purpose of it? And this person was asking, like, if you are in a flow state doing tennis, or I don't know, in this particular case, he was talking about surfing. Is there really any difference between that and the act of meditation? And I think that the key here is that there isn't really a difference if you are able to be mindful during those activities, but there is a difference if you're not mindful, if you're not aware. And we can all sit on a couch, we can all sit there and meditate for hours, cross-legged, in my own case, in extreme pain. But I don't think that's necessary. Once I caught my own glimpse, I guess I'll call it a glimpse, after Dzogchen practice in particular, I realized that it didn't matter what I was doing. It didn't have to be on a couch. I could be sitting there getting frustrated at work, like I actually was about 45 minutes ago, riding my motorbike, whatever it is. That glimpse is always available to you if you are mindful during these activities. And I think that's the key. That can be done in everyday life, no matter what the situation, because ultimately that glimpse is always there. That lack of delusion is always there. So that's my thoughts on this matter.
Okay, so I guess I'm up next year. Everything that I do is my spiritual life. I bring my spiritual life into everything that I do. And thus I become very mindful of the things that I am doing. I ask myself all the time, am what I am doing, is this creating suffering for myself or for others? And if I find that what I am doing is creating suffering for myself and others, then I need to cease. I need to relinquish. I need to stop doing that. And this has been a very interesting, practice, if you want to call it that, in where it's a lot of reflection of what am I doing right here and now, whether it be doing this show, doing the dishes, doing housework, or working for somebody else. Is what I'm doing bringing suffering to other people's and myself? Please hold on a minute.
Yeah. Just to kind of give a little bit of pushback, because I'm kind of curious what you guys have to say about this. I've been, a lot of times when people say I am just aware or just mindful, 9 times out of 10, I really feel like they aren't usually actually doing anything that's actually purifying their mind or striving. It's really easy for it to become a platitude. And so I kind of like, I was a little bit of a, on one level, I do think it's about surrender and just remaining mindful all the time and doing whatever it is that you're, supposed to be doing. But on another level, I also know that can be just a complete scapegoat almost for some sort of moral superiority that's unearned. And so I always am really hesitant. Like I always feel like there's also a place where it's like what everyone needs to do individually is going to be based off of where they are at personally. And what, like sometimes I think there is times to go off to a meditation center. Sometimes there is times for reading and studying. And if you don't do that, I don't think you're really living life in line with your dharma. I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, go for it.
So the superiority, when you say I'm living the spiritual life, I'm doing practice, that becomes a superiority complex. That is definitely not within the the Bodhisattva path. And that's not what we achieve, we strive for. Yet, however, going off to a Dharma center may be practical just because of it is a space set aside for contemplative work. It is a place set aside to discuss your personal issues or your spiritual issues or your spiritual journey with other like-minded people. In the case of a house, sometimes with children and family and neighbors, and just because of the neighborhood, it's impossible to really have that opportunity to focus down or to have a reflective moment.
I guess my question is like, why do anything hard? Like, if it's just a matter of being mindful and kind of surrendering and just doing what you need to do, why do anything difficult? Like, and that's the part where I kind of always feel like when I hear people talk about just being present, mindful, and you're fine, I'm just like, it's not quite. It's not quite that. It's something a little bit more complex.
Then why even bother becoming a monk? Why even bother going to a temple? I mean, if none of that really, if we're living a spiritual life, then one would say, well, then you should be able to live your spiritual life in any conditions, no matter what. You could be you could be a slave, you can be a captain of industry, you can be a worker. What's the difference then? What's the difference between the layman and the monk then?
Bonnie, you want to jump in? What do you think?
Well, again, it's like, as a monk, if you're meditating 6 hours a day, you just consider that to be everyday life. Or if you're studying Dhamma, then that is part of everyday life. You still don't compartmentalize, like when you're going to the bathroom or chopping wood or carrying water or whatever, that's still Dhamma practice. So I suppose some people that are just being semi-mindful and calling that their Dhamma practice, well, maybe it is. It's just not very advanced, and they might not be very far along the path. They might be deceiving themselves. But then again, somebody who has been to 18 retreats and they've been to this master and that master, they might be just deceiving themselves also, because they've got pride and like you were talking about earlier, the superiority complex. So I mean, it's really tricky. And the person who doesn't sit in meditation and doesn't read the books and doesn't go to the retreats, but who nevertheless has few desires and is relatively present and has equanimity, then still, I mean, they're doing better than the person who is just swollen up with pride for having attended the 18 retreats and having been to this master and that master and having read all the Tipitaka or whatever. Mm-hmm. But getting back to something that Alex was talking about, like riding his motorbike, I would point out that a lot of people, they're doing Dhamma practice without even realizing it. Like, there are some kind of sports like motorcycle racing or rock climbing where you have to be in the moment completely, because if you make one mistake for just, a split second, you're dead. And so they're just forced to be completely in the moment while they're doing it. And they might get addicted to that because they don't know how to cultivate that when they're not motorcycle racing or rock climbing or whatever it is. So the trick is to sort of be in that mental state, even if you're just walking up and down the stairs or brushing your teeth or anything like that.
Well, in Zen, we call that, the intuitive, where you're not really saying, oh, you're not telling yourself that I'm in a spiritual moment or I am being mindful. You're literally living an intuitive moment. You are literally being that intuitive person. The one that's riding the motorbike, the one that's scaling the mountain, the one that's on the basketball court, popping in those 3-pointers. You don't think about these things. You just do it. And that's all intuition. But that also leads back into the spiritual context, in which a lot of what we call intuitive wisdom, that spiritual wisdom, comes from deep inside, not from the outer thought process, not from the cognitive thought. We don't think spirituality, we sort of intuit it.
See, I don't know if I would consider the motorcycle thing to actually be a spiritual practice. I think that you can be maybe very like mindful in one sense of the word, of no other thoughts or focused, but I find like spiritual practice usually is allowing whatever defilements of the mind, frustrations, or all this stuff that needs to be worked on, a space to come to the surface to be observed and let go, kind of almost like you're digging in deep to this parts of you that need to become purified and allowing those to come up. And I don't see that happening in that example, and to me that's kind of like the core. And I think you can do that where it's like there's plenty of things to get pissed off and annoyed at life. And the spiritual perspective would be like, okay, allow that to hit you, to come up, observe it, and then use that as like a meditative tool in order to basically accept and release the energies that it just got triggered. um that's the way that I look at it. I don't know if you guys, what do you think?
Well, there are different kinds of Dhamma practice or different kinds of spiritual practice. And like the rock climbing or the motorcycle racing, you are in a heightened state of consciousness. You have to be in a higher level of consciousness than usual. And it feels good. I mean, the more awake you are, it's the more alive you are, essentially. You've got more of the spirit flowing through you in some ways.
What about the purification aspect?
Well, I mean, there are some teachers that say you really don't have to purify yourself. I mean, if you accept everything the way it is, you accept, just whatever happens without like resisting it or being opposed to it, then, I mean, you're there. You don't have to make yourself perfect.
And that's getting more of a Mahayana.
If you can see that everything's already perfect, then you're doing good.
Well, that's getting, like I said, that's getting into more of the Zen, the Mahayana viewpoint of things, where
definitely.
You already have all that you need to obtain. You do not need to purify. You do not need to attain anything. It's already there. It's already within you. It's just more of a matter of opening up your eyes and realizing it. So this is, I mean, when you're talking about the intuitive knowing, where everything drops away and it's just mind and motorcycle, or mind and rock climbing, all the other distractions, all the other thoughts are just gone. And that is a state of Zen for a lot of people. A lot of people will achieve this state of Zen without being religious. In fact, there's a big discussion on a lot of the Zen forums and Zen centers. Is Zen a religion? And the answer kind of comes out to be, well, no, it's not a religion. But the Mahayana is a religion. And when you start bringing in more of the spiritual values and the religious aspirations, that's when we start getting back into religion, such as, the path of the Bodhisattva or that of rebirth and karma. That is a religious view. But Zen itself, what was being talked about with riding a bike or rock climbing, that's not a spirit. That is not a religious aspect, but that can definitely be a spiritual aspect.
Yeah, I just like to see I mean, I really do believe that there should be some sort of expansion of capacity or some clarity. And I usually, if those things aren't there, like, because obviously there's plenty of people claiming to be spiritual teachers or liberated or whatever. And I feel like a lot of times, like, to not be able, like, even with the Buddha could debate, right? He becomes liberated. He can basically explain the Dhamma. He could debate anyone. He can see what is needed to be said and, have all these other abilities. And I just feel like that there should be some within the conversation of like spiritual practices, the idea that like if you're really working in a way that is actually spiritual, capacity and clarity should increase. I mean, that's kind of like, and I just feel like that's usually not included. It's just like, no, just be mindful, just be aware of whatever is. And I don't know, it's just not quite there for me, even though I get where you're coming from. You want to weigh in, Alex?
Sure. It's funny. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I've been thinking about it mainly because of some interactions on the Discord, on Panyo's Discord, about the differences. And we brought up the differences between maybe a Theravada outlook. And I think maybe this is kind of what you're looking at, Manu, is this idea that there can be a seeking or a striving for an end state where I'm discovering the defilements. I'm getting rid of them. I'm at this stage. I'm at stage 2, or all the different stages, getting rid of the various defilements. Whereas the Mahayana outlook, as I understand it, and this is what's occurred to me through my own experiences, and I think the best practice I've seen that really gets to the heart of this difference is Dzogchen. And Zen has aspects to this, but I think that Zen is a little more confusing. Like it's not as direct as Dzogchen practice. And some people might know a little bit about Dzogchen, but what effectively it is this idea of non-duality. That is the dissolution between subject and object, and glimpsing that dissolution. In my opinion, when you have this glimpse, then everything else becomes sort of obvious, because you realize that that glimpse is a glimpse of all there ever will be, is when the experience and the experiencer dissolve and there is just experience. When you have that experience and you realize that that is really the fundamental base of everything, that rigpa, as they call it, is the fundamental base of everything, that there is no duality between subject and object. That's when riding a motorbike or surfing or sitting in meditation becomes mindful, in my opinion. I think that this idea that you need to seek and continuously seek to get somewhere automatically precludes you from being fully mindful of the reality of everything in the moment, because the fact that you're seeking is part of the problem, right? It's like when the Buddha said, everything that arises also passes away. And I find that the element of seeking something is a part of that. It's also something that's just arising and passing away. So for me, I guess what I'm getting at is that practice of Dzogchen, and then I think in Zen it really is koans as well, really induce a state of mind when done properly. For me, that's mindfulness. And I guess in this discussion, we kind of maybe need to discuss what we think constitutes mindfulness, because as you say, it's a very non-specific description. It could mean many different things. But for me, what mindfulness is that non-duality, ultimately. And that being mindful in any other way is not true mindfulness. You might be mindful of your body or the sensations, but ultimately that is just everything that's arising and everything that's also passing away. I hope that makes sense. So for me, that Dzogchen practice was instrumental in understanding what it is I was striving for. And interestingly, I should say, the difference, I think, between the Vipassana type meditations and this Tibetan style or Mahayana style is that they take that initial glimpse, that initial experience of the primordial nature or rigpa, and then they seek to what they call stabilize it. So that's what they do. They have the initial glimpse and then they stabilize that glimpse, because they consider that to be the primordial basis of consciousness, or what would be called ordinary mind in Zen. Whereas in Theravada, I spent many years sitting in Vipassana and entering the stream, I guess, as they call it. And I never had that realization or that glimpse. And it wasn't until I had that glimpse that everything else started to make sense. And then I started to begin to work on stabilizing it, which obviously is a huge ask, but that's what I do these days. And I can have that on a motorbike. I can have that shopping. I can have that washing the dishes or any other type of activity. So those are my thoughts on the matter.
There is a spectrum, different spiritual systems and different reputable spiritual systems fit on a spectrum. Like at one end, you've got maybe Theravada, which says you have to be a perfected saint to be enlightened. You can't have purity of wisdom unless you have purity of mind. You can't have purity of mind unless you have purity of morals. So you have to be a saint in order to become enlightened. Whereas at the other end, you've got somebody like Krishnamurti, who's just saying, if you're not a saint, you don't fight against it. Like if you try to set up any kind of ideal, you're just setting yourself up for hypocrisy and a dishonest life, because you set up this ideal that you can't live up to, and then you just go crooked in a way. So, I mean, honesty definitely is important.
And many of those masters, you know, are famously crooked, right? So they have these spiritual attainments that are probably quite incredible. But then they've gone and done things with their followers, you know, sexual impropriety or whatever it is. And they don't seem to live in the way that they preach, or many of them anyway.
Yeah, well, Krishnamurti certainly did. I mean, I remember telling somebody that Krishnamurti was messing around with the secretary's wife for years, and he was saying, the person's just said so. I mean, that's what he teaches essentially. You know, it's like, you know, if you're a crooked person, then at least you'd be honest about it, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. But even Osho is a great example. Like, if you read his books, they're actually pretty good. Like, you can tell that he has some degree of attainment that's impressive. But then you look at what he did, you're kind of like, you know.
Yeah. And I think different areas on that spectrum suit different personality types or different people better than others. I don't think everybody is just cut out to strive to become a perfected saint. And then, I mean, other people, they have to have a certain amount of moral integrity just to look at themselves in the mirror. So you have to understand yourself well enough to know, you know, what sort of path you should be walking on. I think that's the most important things to know.
Yeah. So the Mahayana really gets into what's called Bodhisattva. And Bodhisattva is a word that does not appear in Theravada at any point. It's not a word in any of the Theravada canon or suttas. But what it is, and it's all throughout the Mahayana, and it's the critical element of the Bodhisattva enlightenment, or that moment of enlightenment. And Bodhisattva initially starts off as the thought of enlightenment, the aspiration to be enlightened, this notion of enlightenment. And it's sort of like you have to have the thought first, this seed, this notion of enlightenment, in order to fulfill, to become the enlightened, to let the enlightened mind emerge forward. And the Mahayana and the Mahayana teachers stress upon the students to develop the mind of Bodhisattva, the mind of wanting to be enlightened, the mind of striving towards this goal. And thus, it doesn't say go purify your morals or purify your body or purify anything. It's more of develop the mind of enlightenment, and then the enlightened, and then it brings forward the enlightened mind itself. It's sort of a two-stage process, is what has been described. And that is more or less the heart and soul of the Mahayana.
I mean, for me, I think about the Eightfold Noble Path, you know, and it's funny because, I mean, a lot of ways I'm not Theravadan. I'm kind of a weird Hindu Theravadan hybrid. But I will say that when I think about mindfulness, I think about one part of the Eightfold Path, that the other parts are equally as important, and that if they're negated, you're not going to get anywhere. Like, if you're mindful, but you don't have, you know, the right view, you're not going to get anywhere. And I think all those things kind of have to be there. Even with livelihood, if your livelihood is not something that's aligned with, I think, doing something that's actually helping people or providing some sort of actual service versus like you're just ripping people off, you're not going to be able to really make progress because you're in that environment every single day. And I think there's a lot of these other energies that come into play, especially in terms of spiritual development. I mean, almost all the progress that I can think, or a lot of the progress I've made, is by doing really, really difficult things. You know, whether it was meditating for long hours or traveling or doing other things that people weren't willing to make sacrifices for. And I think that the insight I gained because of that made it well worth it. And I just, anytime that I talk to a lot of people that, you know, talk about, oh, I'm just mindful of this and that, and I, you know, just aware, I just feel like there is no wisdom usually backing it. There's no real knowing or intensity. I mean, And I mean, also too, I have a lot of warrior energy. I'm very, I mean, going back to Pano's point about personality, I think personality plays a role, but also I think there's a big spectrum of levels of consciousness for different people, and that it's not all the same. And so if you're more developed, you're going to pick a route that's maybe more difficult versus people that are just trying to get by. Maybe you're looking for something that's more comforting, or um, I don't know, just not as difficult, doesn't bring up as much stuff. Because to me, when I think of really serious spiritual work, or the times where I grew the most, were probably the most difficult times of my life. You know, things were the hardest, and that's why I grew the most. And to not kind of put two and two together, I think, is kind of like one of the problems. I mean, it's like, if you want to become strong, go out in the world and do things that are difficult to push you to your limit, so you can end up, gaining a greater amount of insight, purifying yourself more. And then I think it's paradoxical in the fact that at the end of it, it's not about obtaining something, but relinquishing something, the surrender aspect of it. It's not about, per se. I mean, even in the suttas, they talk about, like the Buddha's vanquishing all of his enemies and this type of thing too, the languaging. But I mean, it always kind of resonated with me. I like, how do I say, the fact that whatever I think enlightenment is, I think it requires everything to be as much as possible geared in that direction, and not compartmentalized, like we're kind of saying. But yeah, that's the way I look at it. Anyone else want to comment on that, or we want to go to the next question?
Well, there is one thing I'd like to say with regard to what you were saying, and it's true in my case also. My main spiritual growth spurts, so to speak, have been a result of crisis in my life, where things just aren't like. The first real spiritual growth spurt was when I was about 16, and I just went into open rebellion against the system, and just almost flunked out of school, and just was like partying all the time. And realize, I mean, finally you just crash. I mean, it's like you can't just maintain a life of just not following any rules and just doing whatever you want as a 16-year-old. And I just really just hit rock bottom just as a result of the mistakes I was making, or they might have been necessary mistakes. I mean, they weren't all bad, because I wound up having like a minor awakening. Like I finally started turning towards a spiritual path to begin with. And also, like, as a monk, I was striving to be a saint, trying to be the good Theravadan monk, trying to eradicate my defilements and everything. And finally, I just hit a wall. It was just, what happened was I got really sick, and it was like, I couldn't meditate. I couldn't sleep. It was just like misery. And then I was thinking, I've been a monk for years and years, and if I can just hit rock bottom like this, I mean, what's the point? And so I just went into this bleak depression for months. And finally, I just gave up. I wrote to my teacher. I wrote to my father saying, that's it. I just don't want to be striving to be a saint anymore, because it's just so frustrating. And so I just gave up. And then right after I gave up, it was just like mindfulness was becoming just spontaneously. I'd be at the well, drawing water with, the rope and bucket thing. And you just feel the muscles, tightening in your arms, and the wind on your skin, just completely in the moment. I could sit in meditation and just be like crystal clear silence, which was something I'd never been able to do before. But it was a result of this crisis, which then just like slammed me out of a rut. And there is a really interesting book called Battle for the Mind that says that that's really the way any kind of major shift in consciousness has to happen, because we're so much animals of habit that if some mental state, some attitude gets us through life well enough, I mean, we can be miserable, but if it's keeping us going, that's good enough. But then you get to a point where everything starts breaking down, and your habitual way of dealing with life isn't working anymore. Then you hit this crisis state where you become very suggestible. And that's how like Chinese thought reform works. That's how some military basic training works, where you just break down this recruit until he's just a quivering massive jelly, and then build him back up into this fighting machine that doesn't question orders. Or a lot of like spiritual retreats can work that way, where, I mean, a lot of people, I mean, just doing the Mahasi method, where you're just going in slow motion and meditating, you know, all day long. It can be very stressful, and it can just slam people into a crisis, which then makes them open to something else.
Mhm.
So that kind of fits in with what you were saying about, you know, it's like when you were making spiritual progress, it's because of something very difficult, which in a way it brings on a crisis state to some degree.
Yeah,
So
I'm gonna
I
check out
think it's
that book.
useful. Yeah. Just on that point, I did a video on Douglas Harding. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. He wrote a book called On Having No Head.
Hmm.
He's a Zen guy, but he developed, I guess, this method, very very interesting method of non-dual practice, basically, is what it is. And he basically says that you should try and look for your own head, and you can't see it. And this is his way of spurring that visual based experience of subject and object collapsing, basically. And it's very much like a Dzogchen pointing exercise. But he used to say that, you know, a lot of people would have this experience of non-duality, which is really, as far as I'm concerned, the end point of all these spiritual practices, in my opinion. I don't see how there could be anything beyond them. But he used to say, he used to give it to some people that would come along to his classes, and they would probably glimpse it, and they'd just be like, so what? Like it had no significance to them. And I think that the struggle, the seeking in a lot of these spiritual systems are important, because when you finally have the realization, you also have the significance of what you've realized. Whereas if you don't have struggle or seeking prior to that in some way, then you don't fully comprehend the significance of what you've seen. And in terms of a spiritual system, I think a lot of the struggle that gets set up is for that reason. So you're seeking something, and through seeking it, you can't find it. And then when you finally have that insight, that non-dual insight where subject and object dissolve, then you realize the true significance of what you've seen. I think that's an interesting point in terms of seeking and struggle and that kind of thing that we're talking about now. But I recommend people look at that book. It's pretty fascinating. Very elegant, I would say.
Yeah, that's how Zen koans work, I think. I mean, you're just struggling to come up with an answer to a riddle that has no answer until finally it just breaks, the mental process just stops.
Absolutely. That's absolutely what they are. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
100%. So he has a bunch of elegant exercises, like what is it can you look at what is looking at the moment, stuff like that. And they're designed to kind of, really collapse subject and object effectively. Yeah.
Well, cool. Yeah, I'll share that book. Did you want to comment something, Mark, or you're good? We're gonna go on the next question. Okay. So, the next one was, how should you view money from a spiritual perspective? Honestly, this one was maybe, I mean, the reason why I kind of put this question out there was because of how much I've struggled with my view of money, mostly because my mother especially was very money obsessed growing up. A lot of problems with money. I mean, my parents basically got divorced more or less because of money. So it was, and both my parents were very spiritual people. So the idea of money and spirituality, I don't think that by any means they're opposites or something, or money can't be used for higher purposes. But I find that it's been very frustrating because it's kind of how do I say, I think that it shows up mostly in a lot of like the gray areas. Like I work in sales, and a lot of people that try to even do sales or convincing someone of something, it's like, what's moral there as far as money exchange, where it's like, are you offering something at a fair rate or even rate, and there's like maybe deception. That's one kind of part of this. I mean, I guess now with money, I really just view it as wanting to more or less save it so I can have freedom. You know, I work so I can save some money, and then I can basically just pursue my spiritual life and interests. You know, I'm also paying for school while I go to school. So, you know, most of my income kind of goes there. And I still have to work 40 hours, you know, but I think that like getting over any sort of resentment about work took a long time, where it was kind of like, I mean, even, you know, obviously the fact that I went to go be a monk for 15 months was kind of like, well, you know what? Forget work. Like, you don't need to work. You should just pursue spirituality. And I think I kind of went into that, spent those 15 months. And then by the time I got out, I realized that, you know, I really do think there is a place for money, and that money, basically, whether you're a monk or not a monk, has to be something that you come to terms with, the way that which money's handled, the way that the financial world kind of works, and come to some sort of peace. Because I think if you just become resentful about it, it really works against you. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts. Would like to go.
Well, money.
Sure.
Oh, okay, go for it, Mark.
Sure. I mean, money is just part of our samsaric existence. You know, here's a nice little wad of money. It's just a means to an end. It's a, my relationship to it would be my spiritual relationship to anything, whether it be money, a car, a house, my favorite shirt. The question comes to in mind is my relationship to money creating suffering for myself and others? And then if the answer is yes, if there is some suffering being created because of my views or relationship with money, then and that is causing suffering, then I need to relinquish, renounce, let go of those views that are creating that suffering, because money itself is a concept of mind. It in itself is what they call empty. It's not broadcasting anything into my mind. It's not putting something into my mind that was not already there. So whatever is my attachment, my view, my emotion, my position with money is all within me. And if that position is creating suffering for myself and others, then it's for me to clear that up, to look at that, to meditate on it, and then to hopefully relinquish it.
Well, I mean, money is just pretty much necessary in the West. So it's, even if it's a handicap, and according to Theravada Buddhism, it pretty much is a handicap. There is a sutta that says, where the Buddha is saying that if money is allowable, then sensual pleasures are allowable. But of course, in the West, sensual pleasures are allowable. So I guess that means money is allowable too. It's beyond allowable. It's just necessary. I mean, if you're going to live in the West, you know, if you're not just going to be a beggar, which is what Theravada Buddhist monks originally were, then you have to have money. And if you're not one of the fortunate ones who have been born into it, or you know, you some long lost uncle, you know, leaves you as inheritance or something, then yeah, you just have to work, and it just that becomes part of your spiritual practice. You know, just going to work. And I have found that I mean, I didn't really realize this until I started working again, that I mean, it takes a lot of energy from your life. I mean, you only have a certain amount of vitality, or you know, spiritual mental energy, just not even just mental energy, just you know, the energy of your vital force. So much of that gets put into work, that if you're not working spiritually, you know, trying to bring some kind of practice into your work, then that's just lost. You know, it's just you know, you're making money for it, but you're making money for what, really? So yeah, it is. I mean, money is kind of one of those dangerous things. You know, it's like a knife or fire or something. It can be used positively or negatively, and it can be dangerous. And for most people, I think it is, because I think most people are like in survival mode, where they just think, you know, the more money I have, the more successful I am at survival, or the more successful I'm likely to be at survival. and they just get very attached to it. And lots and lots of, like you were talking, Humble Stature was talking about sales, and that's pretty much of an amoral system. I mean, a lot of businesses, they'll give an honest deal just because that's how they can make the most money. It's all calculated. So yeah, it is dangerous, and it's largely an amoral force in the world, not necessarily immoral, but amoral, and you have to be careful with it.
Yeah, I work in a pretty cutthroat business, I would say. Very, very capitalist, very free market. I will say this: I think that more money in this world is better than less, but you don't want to get obsessed with it, and you don't want to spend too much time seeking it, because otherwise it's kind of pointless to have it anyway. I've noticed a couple of things about money. I think that if you've had some degree of spiritual awakening or a recontextualization of what money is, like in a useful way, then money becomes something that serves you, like your true nature. And you can funnel that energy into a more noble direction, I suppose, because you have a deeper understanding of what it is. But I think it ties in with this thing that humans have about always wanting more of something. And I think the idea of more is very self-centered and very shallow. And I think we often see this with people that seek fame and money. Like, I think they're great examples, because these are kind of traps, I think, that lure people who need to boost their self-esteem and basically prop up, I guess, fears, really, childhood fears of being worthless in some way. And they think that money and fame is going to come up and fix that for them. And I think that a good way to approach money, and I see victims of this constantly in business all over the world. This is so common. People that are doing that, they're miserable, they're alcoholic, they work too much, their families are just in a state of collapse or have collapsed. And you often ask yourself, like, why are you doing this, really? Like, what's the point of this? And I think that they have these beliefs that they're not aware of, that they're trying to satisfy with the pursuit of money. And the pursuit of status as well is a huge thing. There's a lot of ego tied up with status. And without that initial awareness of what you're doing, which I honestly don't think most of these people know what they're doing. Like, I really don't think they've even thought about it. Then you're in trouble, and you need to think about it, and you need to contextualize what it is you're doing, what it is you want money to do for you. And there's a big difference with those things. I think, yeah, it's an amoral force, but it burns people very often. Yeah. That's what I notice every day. I'm surrounded by it. So, yeah.
Yeah, Mark, you got anything?
Well, I live here in Las Vegas. And, believe it or not, I make my living out of the casinos. And it's the amoral aspect of money. I see it every day. It's everywhere I go down there. It is the sole focus and sole existence of Las Vegas. There is no other reason for Las Vegas to even exist except for money. And money has become, for most people, their sole existence. It's their bane, it's their mistress, it's their lover, and it's their tormentor, all one and the same. And again, it's really, like I said, it's really just that your own relationship with money. It's your own views. And for a lot of people, especially here in Vegas, especially the sports bettors and the casino players, and I'm talking about the regular ones, not the tourist. I mean, one would say it's a real dysfunctional view with money. It's a real destructive view with money, but it's also one where it's it's a relationship with money that creates both pleasure and pain for most people, and they fall into this. Like I said, maybe it's a dysfunctional relationship, or it's just some sort of real warped out view of this. But it's a thriving on the wins and the losses. The I have money, I have lots of money. Because in Vegas, you could win incredible amounts of money, but you could also lose incredible amounts of money. Fortunes come and go here every day, and that's kind of the truth. But it's also, I would say that some people really get high on suddenly making a lot of money, and they get just as equally high on losing a lot of money. I believe it or not, I have seen people intentionally blow a lot of money, and they get just the same high as winning on it. It is a interesting phenomenon. So again, it's I come back to that relationship with money, and sometimes people get a little bit perverted in that relationship, a little bit sadomasochistic. It's strange here.
Yeah. I mean, how many like actors and stuff have you seen like where they make a ton of money and they just destroy themselves, like completely destroy themselves? I feel like they have these beliefs like I'm broken, therefore if I pursue money and fame, that will fix what's wrong with me, in inverted commas. It happens all the time, honestly. The richest people I know, I've known, I'd say 2 billionaires, not well, but I've known them and I've been to dinner with them and stuff like that. And like they're not, I would say their everyday experience is not of any more satisfaction than anyone else. That's clear in the way that they are. And that, again, though, I don't want to get too moral about it, because the moralism that applies both ways. I think it's like saying, yeah, okay, we can go through the cases where you have rich people, they screw themselves up, they get addicted to drugs, alcohol, whatever it is. But on the other side, you don't want to be toiling away in a factory for 10 hours a day, I don't think, until you're 90 years old or something, So I think you do want, you want a healthy relationship with it, and you want it to serve you, like what you want to achieve and what you want to do. And yeah, you need it in the West. There's no way of getting around it. It's just the way it is. So
I mean, I feel like money's like the clearest, like, how would you say it? Like, money most clearly shows your relationship to the material world, almost more than anything else. That's kind of the way I think about it. Like, if you would use the material world for spiritual stuff, that's what you use your money for. If you're going to use it for pleasure seeking, that's what you use money. So money is like this, it is kind of the relationship to the material world. That's how I would put it. And yeah, it's interesting. So kind of moving on to the last question here. So do you need to live like a monk to be spiritual? Since I think, well, I'm not sure if you Ship of Fools I don't think you said you weren't a monk before, but I believe
I'm going to say, like, I hope not, because I've never been one. So
yeah,
the most I've done, I've been on retreats and stuff, but yeah, I've never been a monk. So
but I think
this one.
Yeah, I think Mark and Pano definitely have a little bit of experience as myself, and I think that the thing that I found quite interesting was that when I traveled and was a monk, is just how few monks I felt actually had really obtained something of spiritual significance, as horrible as that kind of sounds. I found a whole lot of reasons why people were monks, mostly for cultural reasons or because it just became like a lifestyle. But talking to them, they still had tempers and all this other stuff and were always annoyed, or there just didn't seem to be much they accomplished, because it doesn't seem like being a monk in and of itself can just be as easily abused as anything else. And even in the suttas, the Buddha talked about how there would be plenty of people who would come to the monkhood that would just come for free food or lodging, because you also get like a certain, within at least Asian cultures, you get a certain level of status even when you're a monk. And all these things I think are part of the reason why people become monks, even though it's, like even so I stayed for quite a while, almost a year at a Pure Vina is what it's called in Sri Lanka. So it's like a Buddhist university. And as much as I love the head abbot and all the little monk kids there, they were there for religious purposes. They were there to repeat what they've been told that the Buddha said, and that's basically what they did. And almost none of them had any sort of experience really meditating, or very little. It was all just, this is the doctrine, this is what the Buddha said, and then they become monks, and then they're like career monks, and they said people take care of them. And it's kind of like, it's kind of like being a what's the word, like a golden cage, right? It's kind of what they kind of call it. And it was really funny because I talked to this one Sri Lankan monk who was really, really high up. He was probably one of the highest Sri Lankan monks. And I remember talking to him about this topic, about just kind of like the state of the monkhood. And he was like pretty much disgusted with it. It was kind of amazing to me that he was so open about it. It was like, none of these people are actually doing anything. They're all living in golden cages. And that was like basically what he told me. And I was like, man, and I saw it. It wasn't just in Sri Lanka. I mean, I traveled all over the world, and there was like always like maybe a couple very legitimate monks that really meditated, had a lot of depth. And then everybody else was just kind of doing it for the free ride. It's my feeling. I don't know. So, I mean, as far as like being a monk versus not, after just 15 months, I realized there's not as much difference as you might think. I mean, eventually in the beginning, you have to kind of maybe give up all your creature comforts. But after you kind of get used to not having so much stuff and whatever, and it's not that different, because you're still you at the end of the day. And it's the mind, wherever you are, the mind is. And that's what has to be worked on. So, while you might have a lot more time to work spiritually, I also felt like, because the life was kind of easier, finding the challenges that would have you have a breakthrough were less. And so I really kind of felt like, maybe there's a slight positive to the monkhood, especially if you already kind of reached something close to liberation. Maybe you're already pretty much enlightened, and now you're going to go and just meditate full time, which is fine. But for people that maybe aren't almost enlightened or something, or, I mean, it just seems like a bit of a trap, to be honest. What are you guys' thoughts?
Well, just mentioning money again, it seems like some of the wisest spiritual teachers have taught that you're better off in a state of spiritual, or like voluntary poverty. And being a monk definitely can be a state of voluntary poverty, unless you're one of the really famous ones. I've met a few that practically lived in palaces. But also, it's like in history, if you read history, like the history of science, like in early modern times or the Renaissance, this kind of thing, some of the greatest minds, the greatest writers, the greatest poets, the greatest scientists were independently wealthy. They were of the leisure class, because they didn't have to work for a living. So they weren't, like I was talking about earlier, just expending so much of their vitality just to make a living, so they can, buy the house and support the wife and the children and everything. So just that in itself is setting somebody up for full-time spiritual practice at a level that is, it's not just spiritually working or spiritually, tending your family. It's, you can just throw yourself wholeheartedly into practicing what the ancient texts say, meditation, cultivating jhana. That's one thing that I think it would be very rare for a layperson living in the world to cultivate, the higher contemplative states that are encouraged in the Pali texts, where you're getting into a state of just silent crystal clarity of mind, just perfection of mindfulness, perfection of samadhi. There are so many distractions for somebody living a worldly life that I really think that is just beyond the reach of all but just the most talented spiritual geniuses who happen to be lay people. So that would be one advantage, which is one reason why we put so much emphasis on mindfulness for lay people, because the other of the two main paths in Theravada, that of cultivating jhana through samadhi, is so difficult, even for most monks. But I mean, it's just almost impossible for anyone who is living a worldly life, you know, surrounded by all these distractions and everything. So that would be one definite advantage. But what you were saying about challenges and just monks wanting to live an easy life, yeah, I mean, in Burma, it's probably a very small minority have a genuine vocation, a genuine spiritual calling, that they're really genuinely trying to become enlightened. Very few Asian monks, maybe as many as half of Western monks, at least half Western monks don't handle money. You know, at least they try to follow the rules strictly, you know, and they meditate and that sort of thing. Whether they're striving for enlightenment or not, I can't say. But the Asian monks are just conforming to a tradition that has become rather corrupt, because human nature tends to be somewhat corrupt. But if you read the text, you see how monks lived in the Buddhist time. I mean, they were just radical ascetics, just really, I mean, in the Buddhist time, India was not a Buddhist culture. So it was like a culture that honored renunciants, but still, one of the reasons why a monk has to wait until he's 20 years old, or a person has to wait till he's 20 years old before he can be ordained as a monk, is he has to be old enough and mature enough to endure the verbal abuse that he's going to receive from non-Buddhists. And there was, I mean, just wandering around homeless, just in a state of a radical renunciation, where you don't know where you're going to sleep tomorrow. You don't know what you're going to eat. Just throwing yourself on the mercy of the universe. And Jesus of Nazareth taught something really similar with regard to that also. It definitely has spiritual power, where it takes courage too, where you just throw yourself at the mercy of the universe. You know, you're not building up any security for yourself. It's God will provide, or the Buddhist equivalent, you know, your Dharma practice will support you. Your karma, you know, your meritorious karma will support you, that sort of thing. It really does take a leap of faith. And that in itself can be a powerful thing. Although nowadays, as you say, there's so few. If you're just living in a peaceful, cushy monastery and you don't have any real challenges, you know, you're not having to sleep in tiger-infested jungles anymore, you know, and then everyone's just bowing and agreeing with anything you say, then your only real challenge is just the frustration of trying to live up to this ideal of saintlyhood, of saintliness and sagehood. And I mean, that would be your main challenge. And most people just don't have it in them to really push themselves to the crisis point with regard to that. Mm-hmm. But if you do have the talent, I mean, it definitely is helpful.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that Pano definitely is speaking to the heart of the renunciate, and where you really do put your faith into the Dharma, that everything will be provided to you from the Dharma. And I have heard this echoed by other very sincere renunciates when they really truly renounce the world, when they truly renounce the worldly things and the worldly life, they are literally surrendering to the cosmic Buddha, to the Dharma, to the universe itself. And they would literally say, what comes, comes. And it is a pure leap of faith that very few will take. So the question then is, well, what do you renounce? You know, what does that mean? And generally, you know, a lot of people have a lot of different traditions. A lot of different traditions will have different ideas of what renunciation means. Though, really, in the Zen aspect of it, the renunciation is of those things, those activities, or those objects of mind that create a sense of self, a sense of position in the world, a sense of entitlement, any sense of status and social position. Those are the things that you are renouncing. You're also renouncing intellectual things like, you know, I'm very smart, I have a PhD, or anything like that. And where you're trying to shove leverage, you're leveraging yourself upon others for whatever building of self or building of a the false self, this illusionary self. And thus, when you take the renunciate path, you're almost to the point where there's nothing there for you to build anything upon. There's, you say, "Who are you?" You go, "Well, I'm Pannobhasa, but there's 2,000 Pannobhasa monks. I'm a nobody." There's nothing there for you to build a self upon. You're not there to stand out among the others. I mean, I think Humble Stature said, and there are people that ordain for all the wrong reasons and they actually become sort of an egomaniac, which is not what renunciation is about. But on the other hand, when you become a nobody, you don't even have a name. You have a robe, and that robe could even be taken away from you. You have food, maybe. And you just rely totally on the kindness of strangers. There is nothing there for you to build anything upon. And even the slightest whisper of an illusionary self that pops up, you're going to see it. And I believe it's when in those particular states, in those particular positions, that one can really, really get into some deep spiritual moments, some deep realizations.
Here's a question. Can you cultivate that without being a monk? Can you renounce those things internally? Does it need to be an external renunciation, or can you cultivate that mind state and do that in day-to-day life?
Well, I would say that yes, you can. In Zen, for example, there is what's called the lay monk. And these are men and women who renounce the worldly ways, but they are not aligned with any temple or order of monks. Generally, they'll have a dwelling or a place, a property they own, or they will move into a room of another family member that has promised to take care of them. And they literally renounce the world. They may dress like a monk. They may shave their head like a monk. They may wear holy vestiges like a monk. But they are on their own. They do not need to join any particular order or temple. But in other countries and other traditions, it's much easier to join an order or to be ordained, whereas in some traditions and countries, it's not.
Right. So just recalling earlier conversations, is it then possible that those things that you're renouncing just become another crutch? And I know perhaps we've spoken about this before, but if you put robes on, or you're putting yourself in that situation where I have now renounced these things, is that just another thing to hold on to potentially? Do you see what I'm getting at? Does it matter what the external form of these things are?
I have, like I said, I have met monastics, ordained monastics that I believe maybe ordained for all the wrong reasons, and they created another self out of the positions. And
right,
I believe Pannobhasa has also echoed the same thing. It can happen. Yeah. It's not that it could happen in anything, though. It could happen in a workplace. A person just got promoted and suddenly everything changes about them.
Yeah.
We see it all the time. It really starts with the mind. What is your mindset? Because if you were pushed into something, you were pushed to be ordained, or you thought that you'd be ordained because it'd be cool, or something would happen, but then you kind of you lost the reason. You lost your bodhisattva. You lost the energy. Yeah. What happens then?
Yeah. What would interest me is if you had like initial realizations or initial glimpses, and then you went into the monkhood. I think Humble Stature said this, because then you have the opportunity full time to stabilize that state of mind. I think it could be very useful. But those are just my thoughts.
I feel like with renunciation, you want people like I think a lot of people are willing to say, okay, I'm not attached to this or I'm not attached to that, but never really willing to put their money where their mouth is. And I think unless you actually gave up all those things for a period of time, I think it's really easy to deceive yourself spiritually about your own attainments and how much you know or don't know, or even sort of like, I mean, I think even nowadays within spiritual circles, usually there's like a false humility. It's like, they'll say like, I don't know anything. But then as soon as you question them about anything, they have an opinion for everything and don't listen to anything you say. So there's a lot of that going on. As far as being like, identities that come about, I think the relinquishing of identity tends to come in, is more like an onion where you have like these outer, more superficial things you give up, and then it goes deeper and deeper to the point, like, I mean, in the West, most people identify with their thoughts, right? I think they are whatever beliefs they have. And so as you start going deeper, you start also renouncing, um, beliefs or identities around, um, how to say, like, belief structures. And I think that it applies even to political and other stuff too. I mean, people kind of accuse us of like, okay, well, since it's the spiritual right, you must be also heavily identified as political and right wing and,
Yeah.
believe in this person and that person, but it's not really quite like that at all.
No, I
And I
copped
think
it
that,
on that last video I uploaded. I hit a
yeah,
nest of people that didn't like it.
yeah. And
Yeah.
because I don't think they really understand that you cannot be attached to your beliefs and see it as part of mine and also see it as something worth uh developing. So like, for example, you can um not be attached to meditating but still meditate. You can be attached to, what you think things would work out the best way politically because you develop yourself logically and it makes sense to you, and you're going to try to work towards that for the betterment of all people without being attached to it as an identity. And most people, I think, are so intertwined, especially now with kind of like, as Nietzsche put, the death of God, and there not being any sort of deeper meaning to life. So instead they attach to political things, they attach to all these other, things going on within the world, environmental or whatever, as their identity. And to even imagine that there could be people that hold these beliefs and aren't attached to them seems like completely absurd, like it's not possible. And I think that's just their own lack of development generally.
Well, I consider being a monk to be an easier difficulty setting. Like playing a video game, you got easy, intermediate, difficult, maybe even like the insane level above that.
Hmm.
Um, the insane level, it's like the enemies have, twice as much armor and twice as much vitality and all this. And like being a layperson trying to live a spiritual life is a higher difficulty setting. It's people like the Buddha who set up monasticism, or at least they set up, a kind of renunciation, like a sangha. They had reasons, and it was fairly good reasons. And I think it's probably easier to make spiritual progress for for lots of people within the context of some sort of religious order, like an ordained state where you're following more rules and you're secluded from society to some degree. You have renounced most of the things that people have attachment to, like money and sex and drugs and so forth. All the fun things you're not supposed to do. Anything that you can really get attached to, you're supposed to avoid. If you like it a lot, don't go near it. And I mean, that is it has spiritual efficacy. You can make progress that way, unless you just crack up. I mean, you just can't stand it. But then you weren't you weren't possibly not so spiritually advanced as maybe you thought you were. I was going to go somewhere else with this, and now it eludes me. So I'll just pass the ball to somebody else.
That's a great point, because that's actually, I was thinking that, I mean, I completely agree with you. And it's funny because I actually ended up traveling around the world for about, well, minus 6 months, so maybe like, I guess it was 9 months. I traveled with this teacher called Ciro Tamasara is his name, and he's a monk, but basically rather than just live the kind of normal, peaceful life in a monastery, he started trying to help all the homeless people within Yangon. And he built a bunch of these giant high-rise buildings that house all the homeless. The government tried to shut him down, so he basically built his own city with like 30,000 people in it. It's absolutely amazing, his story. And I remember talking to him because I had so many conversations with him with all the, he basically flew me around all over the world with him when he was setting up meditation centers and talking to the Burmese community in Malaysia and Vietnam and Italy. We set up a meditation center there. And so we were doing all this, and the question was always like, well, why do you do all this and no one else does? And his answer was like, this is where the real battle is. It's in the world trying to, you know, how to say, like, it's with real people with real problems. If you're like dealing with people that actually are really suffering and trying to love and accept and work with them to make their lives better is really where the real work is. Once you've reached a certain level of spiritual discipline yourself, because you obviously don't want to just get sucked into every drama and everything. But I think once you're developed to some sort of degree, there seems to be a cyclical nature here of being in the world for a period of time, and then I think being outside the world. And I respect both, but I do think that being in the world is definitely a higher difficulty setting, as far as being able to maintain a strong practice, because you're constantly influenced by energies that have no interest in spirituality whatsoever, and don't see things the way you see them, and you're almost always going to be an outlier, because to be deeply spiritual is not the norm in our society.
Yeah.
I often wonder what it would be like, Panyo. I know you've done this, but being locked in a cave in the side of the Himalaya for 3 years or something, what that would do to your mind. Because I know, like, even on a 10-day session retreat, like, the change in my consciousness is significant. I can imagine that would be pretty crazy. But
Yeah, well, there's a good chance you'll start talking to yourself.
I was going to say, there's a Burmese story about this where it was like a really famous monk. I can't remember what his name was, but I believe he lived in the hills alone for like 20 years or something, just by himself. And when he got back, they basically asked him, like, did you see anyone else up there? Because I guess other monks had attempted, and, there'd been people that, for spiritual reasons go up into the mountains. And he basically said everyone he met had lost his mind. Every single other person that had gone up there had just become delusional, started talking to themselves, and lost their minds. And I think that that's like 90. If you're really not at the level where you can just meditate all day because your mind's already pure enough, and you go out there for long periods of time and you're alone, you will lose your mind, and that's all that's going to happen. And I think all the rest has been romanticized.
Well, I don't think that's all that will happen, although it is true that if you are a hermit, then you can start drifting away from the way normal people are, and you don't get enough feedback, and you can just drift and drift until you're really just a nutty person.
I mean,
that can happen.
You think if the average person just went out into the Himalayas for 3 years, that they would come back better and not just completely crack under the pressure and lose their minds?
The average person would crack up. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway,
there was like a little mathematical equation that I've done more than once, and I might as well add it here, is that let's just assume for the sake of argument that an ordained renunciant is 1,000 times more likely to become enlightened than an unordained non-renunciant. But even so, there's 10,000 times as many unordained non-renunciants as renunciants. Still, there's going to be 10 times as many enlightened lay people as there are enlightened monks.
That's interesting. I like that. I never thought about that way.
Oh yeah, the Parteka Buddhas.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, I think we've already been going at this for almost hour 20 minutes. Unless you guys have anything else you want to add, I think it might wrap up. Now we're all good.
Yep, I'm good.
Okay. Well, Truth Matters, she wasn't feeling well, but I'm hoping she'll join us next time. Thank you for watching this, whoever's on the other side of this camera. And we're going to keep doing this every at least once a month for this, and then cut it into clips. And then I think we're going to start having guests and putting out one more highly kind of produced video like we've kind of been doing. But we're kind of trying to figure out how to pace this thing. And we're hoping that we can really, make a difference, communicate, and grow from all of this. So may you all be happy, peaceful, and liberated. Thank you.